This program has been brought to you thanks to the generous contributions of our patrons on Patreon. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. And for more content like this, be sure to check out the Modern Alchemist channel on Patreon.
Welcome to the Modern Alchemist channel. I'm Aubrey Forrest, the Modern Alchemist, and this is Alchemy After Hours. Tonight on Alchemy After Hours, we have three topics which, on their face, don't necessarily seem to be related or correspond to each other. But by the time that we're finished tonight, I hope that you will see the correspondence and relationship of these topics and how they relate to each other, and more importantly, how they relate to ourselves. So, grab yourself something to drink, nibble on, and relax as we sit down together and talk about Janus, Kabbalah, and a bag of hammers. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's begin. So, the first topic that we're going to talk about actually has nothing to do specifically with the other three, other than it does provide us an additional analogy that we'll use later on to help us understand and describe the things that we're talking about. Specifically, I'm talking about chickens, omelets, and maybe even cookies, and how they relate to our current circumstance. This is the thing. Many times as esotericists, we like to regress something, to take it back to its most simple form, its most elementary construct, and then determine its relationship with everything else. This is not a bad instinct, not at all. This is in fact what leads to an extraordinary number of revelations that you might have as you peruse various esoteric documents, study sculptures, artwork, architecture, listen to music, watch television, any of the things that might stimulate you and your consciousness towards an effort of discerning what it is that you're seeing, hearing, or experiencing. Well, there is a point, however, where you cannot regress a thing, where, a bell cannot be unrung and where from the point of its new origination, this is what the thing is from this point forward, and you can't go backward. This idea is really relevant to us because I believe if we come from a fallen state where the operations of the universe and our consciousness were considerably different than what we experience right now, that it means that there's a point at which you simply can't necessarily understand or identify with or articulate what it is you're even seeking to understand or identify with. So when I talk about this idea, often I like to relate the idea of making an omelet or maybe even cookies. Cookies often is a better analogy than omelets because they're with an omelet, for instance, if I make a veggie omelet or something, you have your eggs and you've got the materials in front of you, maybe the onions and mushrooms and tomatoes and whatever else you want to put in there, some cheese perhaps, some Swiss cheese. Well, each of these ingredients you can trace immediately backwards, except for maybe the cheese, which is the process of, it fermenting and being made into cheese after it's been gathered, right? But other than the cheese, the vegetables and the eggs, you can look at that and identify what kind of chicken that egg probably came from, and you can just certainly identify where certain items were grown or what they are because there they are in front of you, and we have all sorts of information that will lead us to understanding, hey, this is where this mushroom came from, or these onions, and these are where the chicken's eggs were raised and grown. And so that is the instinct, that's that instinct in operation, right? But once we begin to combine these things, we break the eggs and we mix them all together, beat them together, and we chop up all the ingredients, and then we saute them and prepare them, right, and then put the eggs in with them. Once all that is done, when the omelet is complete, you really can't go backwards and clearly determine where things originated, as you could when they were in their pristine, original, uncut, undamaged, uncooked state. And this is even more significant if you're talking about cookies, right? Because now you could take all the wheat and the cane for the sugar, or maybe the sweet potatoes for the sugar beets, whatever you happen to use to create your sugar, and all of the various ingredients, they could sit in little cups in front of you, and you could say, okay, this is where all this comes from. And then you grind down the wheat and make flour and combine the proper ingredients to make the baking soda, and you're basically unifying all things, but mentally you can still track backwards and go, well, this is how this was created. I ground up this specimen of wheat and made flour and etc., right? But you once you put that in the oven, once you start cooking it, once you have begun to process it and turn them into cookies, right? They're baked. There's no going backwards from that baked cookie. There's no really telling where the wheat was grown, say, and what might have been used to produce that wheat, because it's now been cooked and it's now not wheat anymore. It's now a cookie. And in the same context, there's a point at which we ourselves are incapable of regressing to its ultimate um, origin point, because there have been so many permutations that have taken place between that point and where we are now. We can't go backwards any farther. Well, this is a really important concept to keep in mind, because this is where we are at, meaning that we can speculate on the ingredients that led to us being here, but we cannot necessarily know for a certainty going backwards. All right? We can only know that there are certain principles in operation that exist in the state of existence that precedes the manifestation of material consciousness, but we can't necessarily know the specifics of that. And this idea is related within books like the Kabbalion, or discussions on the secret teachings of all ages, um, wherein by Manly P. Hall, wherein we can gain an idea, have an inkling of what it is that exists in those domains, but we don't necessarily know for a certainty. And that's what life is like here in Malkut, in the lowest aspect of Malkut, right there on the bottom. It's like the oil drip pan of the tree. Everything that existed before, and every permutation that exists before this that leads to this point, each one of those contribute to what we are now, just like the flour and the baking soda and the eggs and everything contribute to making that cookie or an omelet. Those items now take on a new form. They take on a new state of existence within this frame of reference. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, especially when we move to the next point of discussion, which is our bag of hammers. It is important when trying to evaluate then where you are in the tree, or what you're looking at esoterically, that you have more than a bag of hammers. And by that I mean that when all you have as a tool is a bag of hammers, then everything that you approach will look like a nail, because that's what hammers are for. And so your approach to the esoteric will wind up forcing you into positions where you feel like you're really super shoehorning in an idea to make it fit. And to me, that is the first indication that what you are doing is applying a hammer to something that needs a tool with greater finesse, perhaps. Maybe you need a screwdriver. Maybe you need some kind of saw or some other tool, a pry bar, perhaps. I don't know. But some other tool to allow you to gain access to that esoteric concept or principle that lay within whatever it is that you're pursuing. And so when you really do feel like you're shoehorning something, you're like, I want to see how this fits into this particular idea. That to me is the warning sign that you need a better tool, that you need to apply yourself at a more creative level to what it is that you're doing. And so the first thing then is to recognize that when you evaluate the esoteric, that you have many tools at your disposal. Just like any doctor going into a surgical center has a whole variety of scalpels and forceps and pressure things. And I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but when they have a whole tray of tools that they will use depending upon certain circumstances. And one tool might allow them to get to a certain depth within a human being or whatever it is that they're operating on. But that tool then is set aside and it is dispensed with and replaced with a new tool to then allow you to work and articulate the organs or what it is that you're trying to repair or deal with. That's the next step. And some tools you will use where you'll hold things in place to expose something with greater ease, but that's the purpose of those tools, is to do that, to hold an idea in place. When I say that, I'm thinking, for instance, of just recognizing that we have 7 esoteric principles at our disposal, and that those are tools as well and guideposts. Those are the things that could be seen as holding stuff in place, so that when you're separating an idea and working through it, you use those as your forceps or your grips or I wish I was a doctor, knew all this surgical stuff. My wife's going to laugh when she hears this. But the the tools that hold things open, that kind of stuff. That's what those principles represent. And then tools to get into it might represent the 4 worlds within the tree of life. They might represent each of the different spheres on the tree. It might be the pathways on the tree. It might be the colors and the understanding of various colors within a system of a logical system that represents a stratification of consciousness by virtue of its relationship and association to the functionality of those colors within the visual spectrum, right? What does a certain color do? Does it help things organize? Like reds help things organize, and you cook with infrared light, right? Those cookies and that omelet, they're made with infrared light. They're not made with ultraviolet light. That's not going to cook anything. And so realize that, but that ultraviolet light might be just the thing you need for a later aspect. And so you understand that each of these concepts in and of themselves provide themselves as tools for consciousness. And there are so many more. You could look at the Tria Prima and the fact that the universe can be divided into 3 functions, right? But and that those functions are, in a sense, a kind of binary system where they are represented by not one element, but 2 elements combined together to create a new association, a new correspondence, a new function. So it's really important then to be flexible in your thinking, but also recognize that there is a kind of rigidity that is in place, and those are tools of principle that stand as guideposts. These are established lines of consciousness that allow you to structure your thinking within established understanding and established logical fortification. So that's the bag of hammers, and realizing that if you're encountering situations within the esoteric that feel really forced, kind of shoehorned. That's why you'll often hear me go, yeah, if we shoehorn this in, it might work. That's me politely saying, but my feeling, my instinct is that this is probably a misapplication of the tool in question. When it works just right, when the tool in place is in full operation, is when it's working naturally, when it's working with ease, when there isn't any kind of force of consciousness, force of will to squeeze an idea into something to make it fit. And that's again where this flexibility comes, where you just kind of let it go and realize that for a while you're just not going to understand a thing and be okay with that. That's definitely one of the biggest challenges that we face as esoteric detectives. As we go through as alchemists and try to work through these concepts, is that you just aren't going to get to know what that means today. Doesn't mean you're never going to know, but it means that for a while the universe is just going to withhold itself from you and see just how bad you want it. And definitely that's been my experience, is that often it wants to see just how tenacious you are. How bad do you want this knowledge? Because it will give it to you, but you gotta want it. It goes back to that whole idea of you've got to want it. So this takes us to the next topic, which is the Roman god Janus and the idea of Kabbalah and the tree of life and how that relates to this concept. For those who don't know, the Roman god Janus is a god of beginnings and endings. He is a god of gateways or passageways that cross between what we perceive as the future and what we perceive as the past. In a very real sense, Janus represents ourselves, because Janus is incapable of seeing anything more than what is coming and what has happened. And when you consider your process of consciousness, no matter how hard you attempt to work your mind into the present, into the now, it is not possible for us, because we either are looking into what's about to happen or evaluating what just happened. The universe works its magic around us and within us, and our mind can only ask what happened. And if we ask what is happening, we recognize that what is happening is a process of change, wherein the present is true, the future is transmuted through the present into the past. And so a great example is watching a baseball game. No matter what, and no matter how slow that game may seem to go, the truth of it is that the game is never stopped. Something is always leading from one thing to the next thing, one moment to the next moment. The ball is thrown by the pitcher, the ball traverses the space between the pitching mound and where the batter is, and then the batter swings. And then the ball is hit, and then the ball goes somewhere. The arrow of time, relative to what we perceive, is always one directional. It always goes one way, from what was, or from what will be to what was. So this is different than, say, the god Brahma, who has three faces. And this is why Brahma can be seen as a creator god, as opposed to a god of gateways or passages, because he is able to have presence of mind in all the points of existence. Where Janus could be seen as an analog presentation flow of time, Brahma's perception could be seen as digital, because he has that central face that allows him to see the moment without it changing. In other words, the moment's coming, here is the moment is gone, and he is able to perceive simultaneously all of that in one time. And that's That God then, that entity, Brahma, and his perception is translated into the sphere of Binah under Saturn, because Brahma and Saturn are representations of the same entity, the same being, just different cultural perceptions. Okay, and when you see the association between Brahma and his ability to have perception on all levels for future, present, and past, it gives you a sense of the eternal now that exists within the ether, that is the material that vibrates as a result of its congress from Chokmah, slamming into it with pure force. And that force driving into it is what causes the vibration that is everywhere simultaneously. And that our perception, of course, we, on the other hand, are not Brahma. We are more like Janus. And so we don't have three faces, but with our two faces, because we can predict and see the future, and then we can witness it happen in the present as it moves into the past. And so it's when we see our conceptual understanding relative to this idea of us being Janus, it will help as we then understand that Janus and his perception, while his perception of the progress of events it seems monodirectional, the truth of it is, because Janus has memory of the past, because he can see the past, he therefore has a memory of the past. The past can then influence the future, so that the effect of the transmission of time from future to past is coaxial, so that the past also has influence then on the future. And in a very real sense, this then mirrors the flow of consciousness, where waking consciousness goes from the future to the past, and our unconscious mind then works from the past into the future. And when you study marketing, you understand that there are certain things that can influence the unconscious mind to cause it to act a certain way in the future. All of marketing depends on this concept. We now call those triggers, by the way, where a behavior is influenced and remembered in the past that causes it to then create an action at a future point. So there's a lot here to take in. There's one more thing to think about with regard to Janus, and that is that the month of January is actually named after Janus. And so the idea of the old man and the young baby, being at the same point as the year moves from one year to the other, the past year to the new year, this is also a representation of that flow of consciousness, that idea of consciousness, that memory of things past is old, and things that are coming from the future to now are always new. So with regard then to the god Janus and this dialogue we had about can he be placed within the tree, what I would say is that the god Janus, rather than representing a specific planetary influence, represents a process, and that process is the flow of consciousness, and the flow of consciousness as observed in our waking state. So when applying that, then we can see that Janus, the question was, can Janus then be applied into Chokmah or maybe Chesed? Because there are some associations between the two, in mythologically. Specifically, Chesed has a relationship to Jupiter, and so offerings to Jupiter often incorporated an observance of the god Janus at the same time. This was not because they were co-equal, but because Janus represents then the idea that I was a certain way at one point, and now I'm making this offering so that I can have a new relationship with the universe at a new point. And that's what that process is about. So having that deity there honored by association with that process is representative of his stewardship over that process of new beginnings, of a passage from one place to another, both physically or consciously. In this light, then, what we can do is we can see that Janus can be placed at various points in the tree, depending upon how the tree is presented. And this then brings me to our next topic, which is looking at our tools in our toolbox and learning that they can be used in different ways because it is permitted. The tools themselves represent ideas or concepts in a reduced form, a two-dimensional form, if you will, that have three-dimensional format and can be played with and moved and manipulated to reveal new things and new ideas. So let's talk about that really quick, and then we're going to see how Janus can be applied within the tree as we work through the four worlds of alchemy. When I was a kid, you could get this big tub full of these. They're not really blocks; they're little tubes, and then each tube had a little ball or some kind of connective cube, and you could interconnect all of these together and create all kinds of shapes. I'd make molecules and space stations and all sorts of bridges and buildings just by putting them together in certain ways. Well, one of the things that you learn when you play around with toys like that is that these shapes can look one way, and then if you turn them certain ways, then they'll look entirely different. One of the more typical tools that we use is the Tree of Life. This is a tool that has a massive utility on every possible level that you could conceive of. It has colors that are specific to it. It has planetary aspects that are specific to it. Numerology can be applied to it. And the list goes on and on and on. There's an endless application of this. One of the things that we forget, though, is that there's some flexibility in how we decide to relate each of these things to each other. Specifically, does it have to be the triangle, or can I take these and lay them into a line so that I can describe a process of maybe things going from positive to negative or from light to dark? The reason I started doing this was simply because when you study Kabbalah, the first thing you recognize is that when you go from the archetypal world at the very top, and we're going to talk more about all of these in a moment, but when you go from that world there, where Keter is white and Chokmah is gray, the next world down, and Binah is black, when you get to the next world down into Braya, you discover that Tipperet is sitting right there on that gray pillar, as is Yesod and Malkut, and that there's been a color exchange. Now, we talked about this in another class, and I explained that there's a process where you have this descent of power, and it transitions, and it's the Father becoming the Son, and the Son becoming the Father. But there's another way that one can look at this. If you allow yourself to take Keter and move Keter, knowing that the pillar of white, the pillar of mercy, is on the far left, right? Subjectively speaking, or objectively speaking, it's on the far right. As you extend that out, then you just move Chokmah into the middle pillar so that it's gray, and you leave Binah on the black pillar, on the pillar of severity. And this then allows you to see a progression or concept. Now, we're going to talk about the archetypal world and why so many people get caught up in this upper pyramid. The reason for it is because this upper pyramid is this ultra simplification of how everything in the universe is in operation. And then from the simplification, we have permutations of that, which introduce colors and vibrations, which are the result of that initial archetypal interaction, but they themselves are not necessarily that interaction, meaning that they are the result of the archetypal action within the archetypal world. Ultimately, then, what Janus represents is a conceptualization. The god Janus represents a conceptualization of time and the conscious perception of time that we as human beings experience. The idea that there is no present, really. There is no now, because the now is constantly turning into the then and is capturing the future and turning that into what has passed before. And this ultimately, all of this is a consequence of the principle of vibration, which ensures that the living universe, within a living universe, all things move and vibrate, that they go from one state of being to another. And this progression of vibration is in fact then what we perceive as time, right? That it is the principle of rhythm by virtue of the principle of vibration. And our perception of time is one in which there is a constant flow. Now, and as a result, nothing ever truly is, because the process of being is in fact a process of change. So, as we take this idea then, and as we look at this concept, we can now apply it to the question that was asked about whether or not Janus can be applied to the tree of life. When I look at the tree of life, and what we see here is a real simplified version of the tree. This illustration here shows us the tree not by the individual sphere, but by groups of spheres, three each, except for in the fourth world. And that each of these trinities represent a process within what is considered a world, or what I would call a frame of reference. What's amazing is that this is a fractal, which has permutations, so that we not merely have just the four worlds within a singular tree, but that the base and top of each tree represents a connecting point to a world above and below it, right? So if we begin with Atziluth and we work all the way down to Malkut, Malkut then can become the new Keter within Braya, and then it works its way down. So you have a outward presentation of the fractal pattern that exists within the tree itself, and that each of those domains, each of those worlds contain within it the 10 spheres and 22 paths that unite all of it together, and then that creates a new world, and that this is an endless and continuous process from top to bottom, from inside to outside. So, but let's take a look at just a tree. Let's not get ourselves too complicated and examine the tree with regard to each of the worlds. This is the archetypal world, and this allows me to answer a question that Jennifer had asked, which was that we're always talking about archetypes, and what's an archetype? What does this actually mean? Well, in the simplest way of defining it, and that when we had talked previously, I said that ultimately all language is built around certain archetypes that are representative of things that people do, or things that are. So you're a father, a mother, a son, a daughter. You could be an uncle or an aunt, a cousin, and each of these then become the foundation of a tree of language that is descriptive of real things in operation. Another way to look at this is that an archetype represents the original pattern from which all other things are patterned after. And so you take then that idea, and in literature what we see is that there's a pattern for the hero or a villain, a mentor or an outlaw. And so like if we borrow from Star Wars, let's say, then the hero would be Luke Skywalker, the villain would be Darth Vader, the mentor would be Obi-Wan Kenobi, the outlaw, Han Solo, of course, right? The ruler, probably Princess Leia, or if you want to flip it, Emperor Palpatine. But that's just a few, and each of these represent archetypes that are the pattern of behavior, the title, the designate, whatever word you wish to ascribe that says that this is descriptive of that being, that thing in operation. And recognizing, of course, that that's a subjective perspective. I want to throw that in. I mean, one man's hero is another man's rebel, right? Or one man's rebel is another man's terrorist. It really depends upon your perception as the subject observer in the events that are around you. But with the case of Luke Skywalker, because you could take Luke Skywalker and he can be a bad guy. He can actually be a bad guy. Or Mel in the show Serenity. Where he even says, let's be outlaws, let's be bad guys, because that's what they are, and yet they're the hero of the show. So, again, subjective perspective is what you use to define things. And of course, when looking at parents, right, then the subjective perspective is where am I in relation to the things around me? So I have grandparents and parents, and I'm a son, but I'm also a father and a grandparent. See where I'm going with that? So it always depends on you and where you're at in order to use the language that you are then in an effort trying to describe the thing. So the archetypal world then, in the simplest format, is seen here in Absolute, where we have Keter at the top, which represents absolute potential, but there's no force there. We have Chokmah, which represents absolute force, and we have Binah, which represents absolute resistance or entropy, right? And these three are the base function of everything that comes beneath them in subsequent permutations of consciousness and reality. So at its very top point, before anything is actually made, before anything is actually done, we have these three principles in operation. And the way to see it in such a way so that this might fit better in your mind for the tree is to break yourself from the idea of this being a triangle with Keter at the top and allow yourself to do a tinker toy thing and just unhook Keter from Binah and let him roll around to the other side of Chokmah. He can occupy his proper place within the pillar of the white pillar because he is the white sphere, right? This would then put Keter just above Chesed, and it would put Chokmah directly above Titperet, and of course Binah stays in the same spot. An easy way to visualize the idea of the action within Absolute is to think of a rock in your hand. And when you're holding the rock above the earth, above the ground, that rock is in the position of Keter. It has all power and force. However, it's all potential energy at that point when it's sitting in your hand. And when you allow the rock to drop out of your hand and begin to fall, that rock becomes Chokmah, which is all force, and the rock is accelerating now towards the ground. The ground represents, when the rock hits the ground and has stopped, it represents Binah. So when all the potential is actualized in its fall, and then that potential is absorbed into the ground, right, and the rock ceases to move anymore, you have a presentation of the physics of the processes that exist in Atziluth. So keep that in mind as we progress. Now, this idea then allows you to place Janus within the realm of Chokmah. Janus represents the rock in free fall, where it is witnessing, it's looking up and going, that's the hand that was holding me, and it's looking down and saying, and this is the ground that I'm about to hit. And that's exactly how Janus functions. And so as Janus falls, right, the old face is looking up at the hand that held him, and the young face is looking down at the ground that it's about to strike. And there is no point in between. There is no third face where Janus can kind of look out and break the fourth wall and look at the audience like Wile E. Coyote and go, oh, I'm about to hit the ground, right? Where he stops momentarily. That doesn't exist for Janus, nor does it exist for us. So, and you can continue on with the discussion of this process. You can continue on with a exploration of it, on your own times, but this is the basic tool set that you have. The final thing that I want to add regarding the archetypal world of Absolute is that, again, you've got that trinary relationship of father, son, and mother, and that is the ultimate archetypal relationship. So this is the archetypal world, and it exists literally in its most elementary form, representing then the principle that embodies that these as archetypes are the original pattern from which all other things are patterned after them. And that's that world. Now, once we move into Braya, we have the creative world, and this is where that activity that we see in the archetypal world now is manifesting simultaneously within the creative world. You have to understand that all of this is happening simultaneously. It has the sense of a sequential operation, but because of its coaxial nature, because there's a kind of feedback that goes up and through the center, back to the point of origin, that whole coaxial process where the past has influence on the future just as the future will have influence on the past, because the future becomes the past, and the outcome of the past can have influence then on the next future iteration. And that's everything. That's cooking. That's sports. That's everything that falls after that. Um, and so if you're watching like a sporting event, just to solidify this analogy for you, again with the pitcher, the the outcome of the pitch results in the next activity that will happen. If the guy hits it out of the park, then the next activity is anyone on base gets to run to home plate with him. If the guy strikes out, then the next activity could be that the teams exchange places and now his team's out in the field. It all depends upon what is happening, but the structure of everything that is happening isn't reliant upon what we perceive as consciously as a sequence of events. It happens simultaneously, so that the act of creation and the act that results from the creation are self-reinforce. It's much the same as the process in dreaming, where the dreamer is both acting within the dream and being influenced by the dream, which is the subject of their own creation. I know it gets deep, right? Time to take a sip of some coffee or something to keep going here. So that is what we see in Absolute, and that is the archetypal world. And that then descends into Braya, where we have the creative world. And in this place, the same mechanics that are found in Absolute become the principles of structure that will coalesce and develop the principles of actual structure. So this is like pre-structure, and then that pre-structure will become actual structure in the next world below it, which is the formative world in Yetzirah. So in this creative world, then, what we see is an operation where that energy which descends from Binah in the lightning strike slams itself into Chesed, and Chesed then becomes the product of the union between Chokmah and Binah. And as a result, then in this instance, Chesed, in this momentary transition, Chesed then becomes a son archetype, because Chokmah becomes the father, Binah is still the mother, and their product then results in Chesed. And Chesed then becomes a archetype for both the son, and it is representative of a process, again, that we see within Janus, where you have a future and a past, and you are the mediator between those two operations. In this case, a father and a mother, and Chesed becomes a mediator between those operations. Then at this point, Chesed transitions once he becomes his own thing within Braya, within the creative world, within his own grouping. Then Chesed assumes the father role, and Geburah assumes the maternal role in relation to Tipperet, which then Tipperet, as the son, represents the mediation point between Chesed and its high energy, high blue energy, and Geburah and its low red energy. And this then facilitates the role or function of Janus again, where you see that Janus is that mediator looking both ways at two opposing principles, right? The past and the future, between the high octane energy of Chesed and the low octane energy, the resistance of Geburah. This then goes through another permutation. These principles are retained, and they become the foundation of Yetzirah in the formative world. So as the energy is transmitted from top to bottom, the projective force, which is a masculine trait, of that sphere which is driving energy into the sphere beneath it, endows the sphere above to be masculine gendered, and then the sphere beneath it assumes a feminine gender until it becomes a projective force on those spheres beneath it. So that's that lightning strike idea. So as you go from Binah to Chesed, Binah assumes a masculine projective force as it vibrates and pounds into Chesed as a manifestation of existence with creative potential. And then from Chesed, because it now is the highest source point of energy within its own triad, is transmitting energy downward into Tipperet and into Geburah, right? And in fact, it goes Geburah and then from there to Tipperet. And then that descends into Netzik, and then it's moving itself into Hod and into Yesed. So what we see then is that as the lightning strike moves, there's a transition in gender of the sphere, so that each sphere incorporates both a masculine and feminine principle. And by the time that we get into the formative world of Yetzirah, We still have the same mechanics of creation that are displayed in the worlds above it, but now these principles of structure become actualized into the foundations of the material world. And that material world is manifest in Asaya, within the actual world. And all of those things which exist above it then coalesce and drip down like oil in a car dripping into an oil pan under the car, and they become the manifest world that we see above ourselves. And this is where we come back to that whole idea of cookies and omelets and eggs and things. That as we get to this point, once we are in Malkut, in that lowest point, in that little black quadrant that exists at the very base of Malkut, once we get there is no real way to deconstruct and work your way backward because we're cooked. We've become a cookie. We've become the omelet. You can do it to a point. You can understand certain things to a point, but then after a point, you can only project towards those vibratory instances, those worlds of formation and creation and archetype. You can only move yourself into those on the basis of principle and never truly know or understand them because we're here. We can't transition upward through all that because that exists as a component of the structure that makes us what we are. It's like, for instance, trying to deconstruct the origination of a particular thought. You can to a point, but the actual mechanics of what creates that consciousness and what brings to light your recollection of a conscious event is unique based upon the thing through which it must flow, which is you. And that you that you have is so complex, so integrated into everything around you that to discern the specifics, the original state from which all that manifests is virtually, I would say, it's highly improbable. Let's put it that way. It's an infinite universe. I'm sure that it is possible, but highly improbable. How about we stick with that? So that concludes our discussion on these principles. I just wanted to kind of hammer it all in together and preserve for us what I thought was a valuable dialogue that we had shared in a previous office hours, and give us a foundation from which we can then build into new dialogue, where we can have an opportunity to discuss these concepts as I presented them to you and flesh them out even more, because we have literally only scratched the very surface of all of this. We've just touched upon the most fundamental ideas here that are presented within the tree and presented within other esoteric sources that relate to the flow of consciousness that we experience as human beings. And that concludes Alchemy After Hours for this evening, which is a good thing because I'm all out of coffee and tea. And it's time to go get a refill. I'm Aubrey Forrest, the Modern Alchemist. I'll be talking to you soon.